The wagon wheels creaked their final song as my father pulled the horses to a halt beside the Rio Grande. The muddy waters churned brown and relentless, carrying debris from the recent rains upstream. I sat in the back of our covered wagon, my hands bound with rough hemp rope, watching my mother's shoulders shake with what I desperately hoped was grief rather than relief. "Thomas," my father's voice cut through the desert air like a blade, "this is where you get out." I was 19 years old, and my shame had become too heavy for our family name to bear. The scandal back in San Antonio had spread like wildfire through the Baptist community. Whispers about the preacher's son caught in compromising circumstances with another man. The details didn't matter now. What mattered was that my parents, Ezra and Martha Whitmore, pillars of Christian society, could no longer look their congregation in the eye with me as their son. "Please, Pa," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the rushing water. "I can change. I can be different." My father's weathered face remained stone. At 52, Ezra Whitmore had built his reputation on unwavering moral certainty. His grey beard, always perfectly trimmed for Sunday service, now looked unkempt after 3 days of travel. "You've brought enough disgrace to our family, boy. The Lord's judgment is clear." My mother finally turned around. Martha's pale blue eyes, once filled with maternal warmth, now held something I'd never seen before, a complete absence of recognition, as if I'd already ceased to exist. Her calico dress, the same one she wore to Wednesday prayer meetings, was dusty from the journey that would end with one less passenger. "Your things are in the sack," she said quietly, pointing to a burlap bag beside me. "There's some hardtack and jerky, enough for maybe a week." The irony wasn't lost on me. They'd brought me to the very edge of civilization, where the Texas frontier bled into Apache territory, and expected me to survive on a week's worth of provisions. It was a death sentence delivered with the pretense of mercy. I climbed down from the wagon, my legs unsteady after days of travel. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by scattered mesquite and the occasional barrel cactus. The sun hung mercilessly overhead, and I could already feel the heat beginning to press down like a physical weight. "Pa, wait." I grabbed the wagon's side as he prepared to turn the horses around. "What am I supposed to do out here?" For just a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Perhaps the ghost of the father who had once taught me to whittle, who had patiently shown me how to read from the family Bible. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "Pray for your soul, Thomas. Pray that the Almighty shows you more mercy than you deserve." The wagon lurched forward, and I watched my entire world disappear into a cloud of dust and distance. My mother never looked back. Not once. I stood there for what felt like hours, clutching the meager sack of supplies, listening to the river's constant murmur. The sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Now, they only reminded me of how little time I had before darkness fell in Apache country. The stories I'd heard in San Antonio painted the Apache as ruthless savages who showed no mercy to white settlers. They were said to torture their captives, to take scalps as trophies, to appear like ghosts in the night and disappear with equal silence. Whether these tales were true or exaggerated, I was about to find out. I made a pitiful camp about 50 yards from the river, using scattered branches to create a small windbreak. The desert grew cold as soon as the sun disappeared, and I huddled in my thin jacket, rationing the few pieces of hardtack my parents had left me. Every sound, the rustle of wind through sagebrush, the distant howl of a coyote, the splash of something in the river sent my heart racing. On my second day alone, I discovered just how unprepared I was for frontier survival. The jerky was already running low, and my attempts to catch fish in the Rio Grande proved laughably unsuccessful. I'd never learned to hunt, never learned to track, never learned any of the skills that might keep a man alive in this harsh land. My education had consisted of Bible study, Latin, and enough mathematics to help with church finances, none of which seemed particularly useful now. By the third day, weakness was setting in. I'd found some prickly pear cactus fruit, but eating them without proper knowledge had left me sick and dehydrated. My lips were cracked, my skin burned despite my attempts to stay in shade, and I'd begun talking to myself just to hear a human voice. "Well, Thomas," I muttered, sitting beside the dying embers of another meager fire, "looks like Pa got his wish. The Lord's judgment is coming swift and sure." I thought about the life I'd left behind, the comfortable parsonage my mother's, Sunday pot roast, the familiar rhythm of church services. I thought about Jacob Henderson, the young man whose friendship had sparked the scandal that led me here. Was he still in San Antonio? Had his family cast him out too, or had he managed to convince everyone that I had corrupted him? The questions didn't matter now. Nothing from my old life mattered anymore. It was on the fourth morning, as I lay weak and fevering beside the river, that I heard the horses approaching. I heard them before I saw them, the soft thud of horses moving across desert sand, barely audible over my own labored breathing. My fever had worsened during the night, and I'd been drifting in and out of consciousness as the morning sun climbed higher. When I finally managed to open my eyes, 3 Apache warriors sat motionless on their horses, not 20 feet away, watching me with expressions I couldn't read. The one in the center was older than the others, perhaps 40, with silver threading through his long black hair. His face was weathered by decades under the desert sun, marked by a thin scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw. He wore leather leggings and a cotton shirt that had probably been traded from Mexican merchants, along with a wide-brimmed hat that cast his eyes in shadow. Most notably, he carried no visible weapons, though I was certain they were close at hand. The 2 younger men flanking him looked to be in their 20s, their faces painted with thin lines of red and yellow ochre. One carried a rifle, an old Spencer repeating carbine that must have been taken from cavalry soldiers. The other had a bow slung across his back, along with a quiver of arrows fletched with hawk feathers. For several long moments, none of us moved. I lay there in my makeshift shelter, too weak to run even if I'd wanted to, while they studied me with the patience of predators evaluating wounded prey. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable. Finally, the older man spoke in accented but clear English. "You are dying, white man." It wasn't a question, just a statement of fact. I tried to sit up straighter, to show some dignity in what might be my final moments, but the effort left me dizzy and gasping. "Yes," I managed to whisper, "I believe I am." He dismounted with fluid grace and approached me slowly, his hands visible and empty. Up close, I could see his eyes, not the cruel black orbs of the stories I'd heard, but brown eyes that held intelligence and something that might have been compassion. "What is your name?" he asked, crouching down beside my pitiful shelter. "Thomas," I said, then added unnecessarily, "Thomas Whitmore." "I am Naya," he said, pronouncing it with a soft emphasis on the second syllable. "These are my sons, Goyakla and Nolnish." He gestured to the 2 younger men, who had also dismounted but remained standing near their horses. "Are you going to kill me?" I asked, surprising myself with how calmly the question came out. Naor tilted his head slightly, studying my face. "Why would I kill a man who is already dying? That would be unnecessary." He reached into a leather pouch at his belt and withdrew a small clay container. "Drink this," he said, holding it to my lips. Small sips. The liquid inside was bitter and warm, tasting of herbs I couldn't identify, but as it went down my throat, I felt a slight easing of the burning sensation that had plagued me for days. "Why are you helping me?" I whispered. "My wife died 2 winters ago," Neha said simply. "Since then, I have been alone. When I saw you here by the river, dying like a wounded animal, I thought perhaps the spirits had sent you to me." I stared at him, not understanding. Sent me for what? To be my wife? The words hit me like a physical blow. I'd expected death, torture, scalping, any of the fates that supposedly awaited white men captured by Apache. I hadn't expected this. I don't understand," I stammered. Nea's expression remained calm and serious. "Among my people, when a warrior's wife dies, he may take another to share his lodge, to help with the work of survival. Sometimes this is a captured woman. Sometimes it is a man who shows the proper spirit." He paused, studying my face again. "You have been cast out by your people, yes, left to die like unwanted prey." I nodded slowly, not trusting my voice. "Then you understand what it means to be alone," he continued. "In our world, alone means dead. Together, we might both survive." One of his sons, Goyakla, I thought, said something sharp in Apache. Neha responded in the same language, his tone firm but not angry. The young man fell silent, though his disapproval was evident. "My son thinks I should leave you to die," Neo translated. "He says you are weak, that you will bring trouble to our people." He may be right about the trouble. He stood and brushed sand from his knees. But weakness can be remedied with time and proper teaching. I tried to process what he was offering. In the span of 5 minutes, my understanding of everything, Apache culture, my own situation, what it meant to survive in this land, had been completely overturned. What would being your wife mean?" I asked hesitantly. "It would mean you belong to someone again," Naor said. "You would learn our ways, contribute to our survival, share in our protection. In return, you would give loyalty, obedience when necessary, and companionship." The practical nature of his proposition struck me as oddly honest after a lifetime of my father's religious rhetoric about divine will and moral certainty. Here was a man offering a straightforward exchange: service for survival, belonging for loyalty. "And if I refuse?" Naor shrugged. "Then we leave you here to finish dying, and I continue to be alone." I looked around at the harsh landscape that had nearly killed me in 4 days, then back at this weathered Apache warrior who had just offered me a lifeline I'd never expected. The choice, when stripped of everything else, was simple: death or transformation. "I accept," I whispered. Naor nodded once, as if he'd expected nothing else. He said something to his sons in Apache, and Nolnish, the one with the bow, brought over a gourd filled with water. As I drank gratefully, Naor began gathering my few possessions. "From this moment, you are no longer Thomas Whitmore," he said as he helped me to my feet. "That man died by this river. You will need a new name, one that reflects your new life." He considered for a moment. "I will call you Bitter Water, for the place where I found you and the tears you have shed." As they helped me onto one of their horses, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the Rio Grande's murky surface. The face looking back was sunburned, hollow-cheeked, and desperate, barely recognizable as the preacher's son who had left San Antonio a week ago. Maybe Naya was right. Maybe Thomas Whitmore had died here. But as we rode away from the river toward the Apache stronghold in the distant mountains, I couldn't help wondering what kind of man Bitterwater would become. The Apache rancheria clung to a hidden valley in the Chizos Mountains like a secret whispered to the stones. As we rode through the narrow entrance, barely wide enough for 2 horses, I understood why the US Army had never been able to completely subdue Naya's people. This place was invisible unless you knew exactly where to look, protected by walls of red rock that rose like cathedral spires into the desert sky. The settlement consisted of roughly 30 wickiups, dome-shaped dwellings made from bent oak branches and covered with brush and hide. Smoke rose from several cooking fires, and I could see women preparing food while children played with handmade toys in the dust. Dogs barked at our approach, and conversation stopped as people emerged to stare at the white man riding behind. Their war leader, Naya's Wickiup, sat slightly apart from the others, near a small spring that provided fresh water to the entire community. It was larger than most, clearly built for 2 people, though it had obviously housed only one for some time. As he helped me dismount, I caught whispered conversations in Apache, some curious, others clearly disapproving. "They're talking about me," I said, stating the obvious. "Yes, Naya," replied matter-of-factly. "Some think I've made a mistake. Others are simply curious about what kind of man would let his own people cast him out to die." An elderly woman approached us, her grey hair braided with small bones and colored beads. Her face was deeply lined, but her eyes were sharp and intelligent. She spoke rapidly to Naya in Apache, gesturing toward me several times. "This is my mother-in-law," Doest Naya said. "She was my wife's mother, and she has strong opinions about most things." "What is she saying?" "She wants to know if you can cook, so gather food, or make yourself useful in any way. She also wants to know if you're going to bring soldiers down on us." I looked at Dallas, whose weathered face showed polite skepticism. "Tell her I'm willing to learn whatever needs learning. As for soldiers..." I paused, thinking of my father's rigid morality and my mother's cold dismissal. "The people who cast me out won't be sending anyone to look for me." Naya translated, and Deost's expression softened slightly. She said something else, shorter this time, and walked away. "She says you may live if you're not too stupid to learn." Over the following weeks, I discovered just how much I needed to learn. Everything I'd taken for granted in civilized society, food, shelter, clothing, even water, required constant work and attention in the Apache way of life. Dast became my primary teacher, showing no patience for weakness, but displaying surprising kindness when I genuinely tried to improve. My first lesson was in gathering food. The desert that had seemed barren and lifeless to me actually provided abundant sustenance if you knew where to look. Deus taught me to identify edible plants, prickly pear pads that could be roasted and eaten, mesquite beans that could be ground into nutritious flour, agave hearts that provided both food and fiber. We collected acorns from the scattered oaks in the higher elevations, and I learned the laborious process of leaching out the bitter tannins to make them edible. The desert provides for those who understand it, Dast explained as we worked together, grinding mesquite beans on a flat stone metate. White men see emptiness because they don't know how to look. Learning to look with Apache eyes was perhaps the most fundamental change I had to make. Where I had seen only brown dirt and scattered rocks, they saw a complex ecosystem full of signs and messages. Animal tracks told stories about where to hunt and where to avoid. The behavior of birds indicated the presence of water or the approach of enemies. The growth patterns of plants revealed the history of rainfall and the promise of future abundance. Naor took charge of teaching me the skills of survival and warfare. Despite my initial weakness, I discovered I had good balance and steady hands, assets that served me well in learning to use bow and arrow. My aim was terrible at first, but Naor was patient, showing me again and again how to nock the arrow, draw the string, and release with smooth follow-through. "Don't think so much," he advised, as I missed yet another shot at a practice target. "Your mind makes you slow. Trust your body to know what to do." It was advice that applied to more than just archery. Everything about Apache life required a kind of instinctive understanding that couldn't be taught through words alone. You learned by watching, by doing, by making mistakes and suffering the consequences. One evening, about a month after my arrival, Naor and I sat beside our fire sharing a meal of roasted rabbit and gathered greens. The conversation had been sparse. It often was, as I was still learning to read the subtle communications that made up Apache social interaction. "You're adjusting well," he said suddenly. "Better than I expected." I looked down at my hands, now calloused from constant work, then at my arms, which had grown lean and strong from daily labor. My hair had grown longer, and Deist had shown me how to braid it with small ornaments in the Apache style. I probably looked more like a native now than the pale preacher's son who had been left to die by the Rio Grande. "I had good teachers," I said, "and not much choice." "There is always choice," Naor said seriously. "You could have chosen to die. You could have chosen to resist learning. You could have chosen to remain bitter about what brought you here." He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks up into the star-filled sky. "Instead, you chose to become someone new. Is that what I've done? What do you think?" I considered the question. The man sitting by this fire, comfortable in buckskin clothes, planning tomorrow's hunting expedition, speaking basic Apache phrases, was he the same person who had once led hymns in his father's church? The same person who had been paralyzed by shame and the fear of judgment? "I think Thomas Whitmore died by that river, just like you said," I answered finally. "I'm not sure who replaced him yet." Naor smiled the first time I'd seen him show such open pleasure. Bitterwater is still deciding who he wants to be. That is good. A man should choose his own path, not have it chosen for him by others' expectations. That night, as I lay in my blankets, listening to the desert wind sing through the rocks above our valley, I thought about paths and choices. My father had tried to force me onto a path of rigid moral certainty, where deviation meant damnation. The Apache way seemed to offer something different, not the absence of rules, but rules based on survival, community, and practical wisdom rather than abstract moral pronouncements. I was still pondering these thoughts when Goyakla appeared. At the entrance to our wickiup, Naor's son had maintained his initial hostility toward me, though he'd stopped expressing it openly after a sharp conversation with his father that I hadn't been able to follow. "Soldiers are coming," he said in English, his tone urgent but controlled. 3 days' ride, maybe 2 if they push hard. 40 men, maybe more. Naor was on his feet instantly, his relaxed evening demeanor replaced by the focused alertness of a war leader. "How do you know?" "Spotted by the scouts at Needle Rock. They're following the old cattle trail from the Rio Grande, asking about Apache tracks at every waterhole." My stomach dropped. Are they looking for me? Goyacla's expression was cold. Did I not say this would bring trouble? No, Naor said firmly. If they were looking for him specifically, they would have started their search at the river where we found him. This is a routine patrol, but that doesn't make them less dangerous. He began moving around the wickiup, gathering weapons and essential supplies. We'll break camp before dawn and move deeper into the mountains. Send word to scatter the horse herds. If we can't take them, we make sure the soldiers can't use them either. As Goyacla ran off to spread the word, I stood frozen, with the sudden realization that my presence had put this entire community at risk. The stories I'd heard about Apache raids and cavalry responses weren't just tales. They were the reality of a brutal, ongoing war for survival and territory. This is my fault, I said. Naor paused in his preparations. No, this is the world we live in. Soldiers come whether you are here or not. He studied my face in the firelight. But now you must decide. Bitter water when the fighting comes, and it will come. Which side will you choose? The question hung in the air like smoke from our dying fire. In a few hours, I might face men who looked like me, spoke my language, and represented the civilization I'd been born into. And I would have to choose whether to stand with them or with the Apache who had saved my life. As it turned out, the choice would be simpler than I expected, but making it would change me in ways I could never have imagined. The attack came at dawn on the second day of our retreat, just as we were breaking camp in a box canyon that Naor had chosen for its defensive advantages. I was helping Deus pack the last of our supplies when Nolnish came racing down from his lookout position on the canyon rim, his horse lathered with sweat. They found us, he called out in Apache, then switched to English for my benefit. Soldiers, coming up the main trail. Maybe 20 men, but more coming behind. The camp exploded into controlled activity. Women gathered children and essential supplies, heading for hidden caves higher up the canyon walls. Warriors checked their weapons and took positions behind the scattered boulders that would provide cover. In minutes, our temporary home was transformed into a fortress. Naor pressed a Winchester rifle into my hands, a weapon I'd never used but had watched him maintain religiously. Stay low, watch where you shoot, and remember that hesitation will get you killed, he said. Then, more gently, you don't have to do this. You could surrender to them, tell them you were captured. I looked down at the rifle, its metal warm. From the morning sun, then back at the man who had become my husband in the Apache way of thinking about such relationships. Not romantic love, as white society understood it, but something deeper. Partnership, mutual dependence, shared survival. Where would I go, I asked. Back to San Antonio to face my father's congregation. Back to a world that already decided. I was dead to them. I worked the rifle's action, chambering around as I'd seen him do. This is my home now. These are my people. Naor nodded once, then moved to his own position. I found cover behind a fallen log about 30 yards from the canyon's mouth, with a clear view of the trail but good protection from return fire. The waiting was the hardest part. I could hear the horses approaching, the jingle of equipment and low voices of men trying to move quietly through terrain they didn't understand. My heart hammered against my ribs, and my palms were slick with sweat despite the morning chill. When they appeared, they looked nothing like the Apache raiders of frontier legend. These were regular cavalry, tired men on tired horses, their blue uniforms dusty from days of patrol. Their faces showed the wary alertness of soldiers in hostile territory, but also something else, the casual confidence of men who believed their superior weapons and numbers made victory inevitable. The officer leading them was young, probably no older than me, with lieutenant's bars on his shoulders and the kind of mustache that suggested he was trying to look older than his years. He raised his hand to halt the column when they reached the point where our trail entered the canyon. "Apache tracks," I heard him say to his sergeant. "Fresh ones. Could be the band that hit the Martinez Ranch last month." They had no idea we were watching from 20 yards away, that rifle sights were already trained on them, that they'd ridden into what amounted to an ambush. The Apache way of warfare wasn't about glorious cavalry charges or formal battles. It was about survival, which meant using every advantage and showing no mercy to enemies, who would show none in return. The lieutenant made his fatal mistake when he decided to pursue us into the canyon rather than calling for reinforcements. Perhaps he thought the glory of capturing an Apache stronghold would advance his career. Perhaps he simply underestimated his opponents. Either way, he led his men into a killing ground. Naya's shot dropped the lieutenant from his saddle, and suddenly the canyon erupted in gunfire. The soldiers, caught in the open, tried desperately to find cover, while their horses reared and bolted. Some of the men managed to reach the canyon walls, but others fell in the first devastating volley. I found myself firing without conscious thought, working the Winchester's lever action and squeezing the trigger at blue-uniformed figures who were trying to kill my adopted family. The rifle kicked against my shoulder, and through the smoke I saw a soldier spin and fall. Whether I had hit him or if the shot came from someone else, I couldn't tell and didn't care. The battle lasted perhaps 10 minutes, an eternity while it was happening, but over almost before I could process what had occurred. When the shooting stopped, 12 soldiers lay dead in the canyon bottom, their blood seeping into the desert sand. The survivors, maybe 8 men, had managed to retreat down the trail, carrying their wounded and leaving their dead behind in the sudden silence. I could hear my own breathing, harsh and rapid. The Winchester felt impossibly heavy in my hands, and I realized I was shaking. Not from fear now, but from something else, a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and a strange kind of exhilaration that disturbed me. Naor appeared beside me, placing a steady hand on my shoulder. "You did well," he said simply. "Better than well." I looked around at the scene of carnage, at the Apache warriors already moving among the bodies to gather weapons and supplies. This was the reality of frontier warfare, brutal, efficient, and completely removed from the romanticized tales I'd heard in church socials back in San Antonio. "Is this what you expected when you took me as your wife?" I asked. "I expected you to choose," Naya replied. "Today you chose. Now you know who bitter water really is. But did I?" As we moved through the canyon collecting the soldiers' weapons and horses, stripping the dead of anything useful before giving them a simple burial, I wondered what my parents would think if they could see me now. Their son, the one they'd left to die rather than face scandal, had become exactly the kind of savage they'd been taught to fear that evening. As we made camp in a new location deeper in the mountains, Daoist approached me while I was cleaning. The Winchester, she studied my face for a long moment, then nodded approvingly. "Now you are truly Apache," she said in English. "Blood shared makes family stronger than blood inherited." Over the following months, as word of the canyon battle spread, I found my position in the band had changed completely. The other warriors no longer saw me as Naya's strange charity case, but as a proven fighter who had chosen to stand with them when the choice mattered. The women included me fully in their conversations and work. The children, who had been shy around me before, now came to hear stories about the white man's world, tales that seemed as exotic to them as Apache life had once seemed to me. Nayar and I settled into a routine that felt as natural as breathing. We hunted together, fought together when necessary, and shared the countless small tasks that made survival possible in harsh country. Our relationship deepened beyond mere partnership into something I'd never experienced. Complete mutual dependence and trust. One night, as we sat by our fire watching stars wheel across the desert sky, I asked him something I'd been wondering. About 4 months, do you ever miss your first wife? He was quiet for so long I thought he might not answer. Finally, every day, she was different from you. Gentle where you are strong, patient where you are quick to act. But missing her doesn't mean I value you less. He looked at me directly. She gave me peace. You give me purpose. I understood. The man I'd been in my father's world had been shaped by guilt, shame, and the constant fear of not measuring up to impossible standards. Bitter water was forged by necessity, hardship, and the simple requirement to be useful to people who depended on him. It was a harder identity, but also a cleaner one based on actions rather than adherence to abstract principles. As winter settled over the Chizos Mountains, I realized I'd stopped thinking about my old life entirely. The seasons of hiding from cavalry patrols, hunting in the high country, and sharing the close quarters of winter camps had completed my transformation. When I looked in the mirror-still water of mountain pools, I saw an Apache warrior looking back, lean, weathered, competent, and completely at home in a world that would have terrified Thomas Whitmore. But it was in the spring, when word came that the army had established a new fort just 50 miles from our territory, that I truly understood what my choices had cost and what they had gained me. They're offering amnesty, Nolish reported after returning from a scouting mission. Any Apache who surrenders voluntarily will be relocated to the reservation in Florida, but they won't be harmed. Around our council fire, the debate raged. For hours, some of the older warriors remembered relatives who had accepted similar offers and disappeared forever. Others argued that continued resistance would only bring more soldiers and more death. Finally, all eyes turned to Naor as war leader. The decision was ultimately his, but I knew he would consider every voice before making it. What do you think? Bitter water, he asked quietly. You know their ways better than any of us. I considered the question carefully. Did I know their ways? I had grown up among whites, but I'd been an outsider even then. The preacher's son who couldn't fit the mold, who carried shame his family couldn't bear. The army officers I'd seen in San Antonio had been products of the same rigid system that had cast me out. I think, I said slowly, that they're afraid. They wouldn't offer amnesty unless they knew we could keep fighting indefinitely, and afraid. Men make desperate decisions. Nao nodded. Then we continue as we are, free, but always watching for soldiers, always ready to fight or run. It wasn't a decision anyone could make lightly. It meant more years of constant vigilance, more battles. Like the canyon fight, more friends lost to cavalry bullets. But it also meant remaining true to the identity I'd chosen when I picked up that Winchester and fired my first shot at men who looked like my father. That night, as I lay in our wickiup, listening to the desert wind, I thought about the path that had brought me here. My parents had intended to kill me with their abandonment, but instead they had freed me to become someone neither they nor I could have imagined. Their shame had become my strength, their rejection my liberation. I was no longer bitter water, the rescued white man learning Apache ways. I was simply Apache, a warrior, a husband, a member of a people who had taught me that belonging isn't inherited, but earned through shared struggle and mutual loyalty. In the morning, we would break camp again, moving deeper into the mountains to avoid the soldiers who would surely come. We would hunt and gather, fight when necessary, and maintain the ancient rhythm of survival that had sustained the Apache long before white men came to this desert. And I would be with my people in my chosen home, living the life I had created, from the ashes of the one that was taken from me. The man my parents had left to die by the Rio Grande was indeed gone forever. But the man who had replaced him was fully alive, completely free, and absolutely certain of where he belonged. If this story of transformation and finding belonging in unexpected places moved you, please take a moment to leave a comment about your thoughts. Hit that subscribe button to join our community of storytelling enthusiasts. And give this video a thumbs up to help others discover these incredible tales of the American frontier. Your support helps us continue sharing these powerful stories of human resilience and redemption.